Hi there. I've been thinking a lot about what new characters and subplots might be introduced in House of the Dragon Season 2, and which ones might get cut. And give you my conclusion up front, the only real distinction is I don't think we're going to see Greyjoys and Martells in the flesh in Season 2. That isn't a problem because they're probably going to show up in Season 3 or something. But everyone else, this more or less works out. This is all reacting to the question of that there's 8 episodes instead of 10. Now, I don't have a problem with that. That's just, what are the chapter breaks? Talk about this in other videos, that it wasn't reduced from 10 to 8. It looks like that increasingly they're talking about having more seasons, and now at least 4 seasons. So I'm unconcerned. I don't think there's subplots they're leaving out. I think that they got the extensions they needed because it was a major success for them. Still, what could you reasonably fit in? And this is stupid. This is just... I had to let go of some of my basically fanfic ideas for when I thought, oh, we're going to get 5 seasons of 10 episodes each before the end of the dance. That's not happening. But I thought, oh, they'll pad it out. And there is a legitimate argument that, okay, first off, if we invent entire storylines, there's no guarantee they'd be good. And they'd slow the pacing down, and pacing is a real concern. Even if it's good stuff, that I thought they'd, invent scenes of meeting delegates from other great houses in order to set up storylines in Season 3, and that would simply take too much time. That I don't think... You could have done it, but it's a stretch. The way this made more sense, I thought, well, who would they introduce, who wouldn't they introduce? And they're going to cut some characters, unfortunately, like the third-tier stuff. It's not that different from when there's POV chapter narrators in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, that they're not going to go, meanwhile, this is what the Caswells were doing. You need a viewpoint character. In this case, Alicent's fourth child, Daeron. Or in the Riverlands, they're not just going to suddenly jump cut to House Blackwood fighting somewhere without characters we saw from Season 1. But what you do is you branch out. That you have Daemon go to the Riverlands, have him meet the Blackwoods, and then Season 3, the Blackwoods might get their own story. It's sort of like a Brienne of Tarth was originally a secondary character in the Catelyn, Renly, Baratheon storyline. But then by Season 3, Season 4, she's carrying her own storylines. I like how Ryan Condal pointed out, the books are written pretty cinematically, that there's always the viewpoint character, that stories branch out to new characters who were already introduced. You don't just skip to someone who hasn't been introduced already. Or that Theon is in Book 1, then you actually go to the Iron Islands with him to see his family in Book 2. So a question of, would we see the Blackwoods and the Tullys, or would they be cut? I think Daemon's going to meet the Blackwoods in Season 2, and I really think that because they did a lot to set them up in Season 1. With having them have their duel, the Blackwood Bracken duel over her at Storm's End. They mentioned the Blackwoods again in Episode 6 of the Small Council. They were really setting them up. That the Brackens, of course, side with Aegon just because, well, we're not going to side on the same side that the Blackwoods are. There is a question of would they have every single Blackwood character or streamline it? That there's Bloody Ben as he's the young heir, and his aunt Black Allie is older, and then there's the bastard the brother who's the really good archer. They might cut one of those. Or Pate of Longleaf is another major character in the Riverlands army. He's just a commoner who slays a lord and becomes a war leader. And you could cut him and still tell the same story, and I wouldn't be upset, because there isn't... You condense characters that's at that level, and he's not like a named Great House member. So some of these might get switched around. I'm not really concerned, but it's just thinking this out. Would these storylines and subplots from the book interact with a character from Season 1? Would they? Am I afraid they're going to cut the Blackwoods? No, because Daemon meets them. They might hold off on actually casting the Tullys in Season 2, because it's this whole thing that the aging Grover Tully is bedridden, he's dying, and he's an Aegon supporter. But his grandson says, I'm a Rhaenyra supporter, I'm just going to wait for him to die of natural causes, then I'll switch to you guys. But for now, we're shutting our gates and we're neutral, we'll sort this out. So there's reasons that the Tullys enter the war late. You might want to cast them when they make a full appearance, particularly his great-grandchildren, the lads, who will become characters later. So we might not see all of the Tullys. We might just see Grover and his son, who is unnamed in the book. His grandson, and two. So they might work that out. The Tullys don't make a big appearance. It's really the Blackwoods step up as the viewpoints for the Riverlands early on. But then the young Tully great-grandsons, who are like all teenagers, they come together with the Blackwoods. Collectively, they're called the Lads in the final stage of the war, the Blackwood-Tully alliance. So I'm not concerned, well, the Tullys don't do that much at this point in the war. Fine, we wouldn't see. It doesn't mean they're cutting them, just that they don't chronologically appear, so I'm not worried. Similarly, that you have to follow a viewpoint character. Jace is traveling north to the Eyrie and Winterfell. So they mention by name we'll see Jane Arryn. They don't need to introduce all of her cousins at this point. They could mention them in dialogue. It's the same story. That doesn't mean they're cutting them, just we haven't introduced them yet for like season 6. For a Regency era show, they introduce that later. So Jane, Jess Redford, they'd show that it helps that in this prequel era there aren't giant families the way there were in A Song of Ice and Fire, where you had to know every Tyrell cousin or every Frey. Now, they're small family group. Each of the great houses, other than the Targaryens, the 8 other great houses, are relatively small numbers of characters. It's Jane Arryn and 1 or 2 retainers. The Starks, case in point, the Starks. Cregan is really the only... He's going to see Jane and he's going to see Cregan at Winterfell. Cregan's wife recently died. He has an infant son who is not a character yet. So it's really just Cregan. Though, of course, one big question we have, and I just have to admit I don't know, is will they include the subplot with his alleged bastard half-sister Sarah Snow? And that'll be really cool to put in, and I understand if they cut it for time reasons, and this whole thing in the source material in Fire and Blood, the more established historians say Sarah Snow never existed, and that Mushroom made her up. But it's an interesting idea, or at least give a nod that she exists in the show. I'm not sure how they'll play that, but that's an open question. But even then, we're talking 1 or 2 characters. And it's not a sprawling subplot. The story of Sarah Snow is alluded to in about a paragraph in Fire and Blood. I'm not really that worried about it. If they cut it, I'd be mildly disappointed. But it's not like, oh my god, they're cutting Daeron or something. Case in point, Daeron wasn't cut from the TV show, but they said he will show up in Season 2. He was in Old Town, where he was squiring, and how they introduce him, and the other High Towers. That the Tyrells sit this one out. They have an infant lord, they declare their neutrality, you don't need to know them. But Daeron is the viewpoint character, the POV character for the Reach storyline, so that's why I kept saying you can't cut Daeron. Not just because he's another Targaryen, but because the entire Reach subplot, if this was a book, he'd be the POV narrator. It's through his eyes, and you lose that entire set of characters. So I don't know if we'll see every other High Tower. You really just need Ormond and maybe Brynden, his right hand, his cousin who's the best knight they have. And, there's a couple of other noble houses from the north part of the Reach that side against them. That, look, you're not the overlords of the Reach. You're not the Tyrells. The High Towers don't rule over us. We side with Rhaenyra. Particularly the Caswells, who control the north center around Bitterbridge, because you killed our lord. So his son and the rest of his family declare for Rhaenyra. In the books, it's like the Caswells, Rowans, and Tarleys, plus a couple of others like the Beesburys. I don't know if they'd... Thaddeus Rowan is a major recurring character in the Regency era. Would you need to introduce... They'd name drop him at least. It's not a binary choice of just, well, we cut them or not, but mention him in dialogue at least. They could say, but you need one guy to be fighting over, just on a map. I'm sorry I'm brainstorming here, but you need 1 or 2 guys at the other side of the battlefield shouting orders as they're fighting Daeron's army, the Hightower army. So I don't expect them to include every single subplot. These are third-tier characters, the Caswells, the Rowans, but mention it in dialogue. You don't need to cast people. I'm not worried, because that subplot exists around Daeron. Then in terms of geographically, are there other things they would cut or not? I really don't think so. Sort of on the level of will they cut Sarah Snow or not? Well, no, if they cut her forever. One character who I know they would need to introduce by the later seasons, but I hope they acknowledge by season 2, is Jason Lannister's wife, Joanna. Joanna with an H. Tywin's wife was Joanna without an H. That she's a Westerling, Joanna Westerling Lannister. She's like the niece of Harold Westerling. I don't know how they're going to work that in, but she becomes a major character in her own right. And I don't know if they would at least need to have Jason mention, I have a wife named Joanna in dialogue. I don't know if she's going to be in season 2, but I don't think they cut her. They can't. So all that aside, I've been rambling for 10 minutes. There are certain minor characters that I'm worried they cut, like Trombo, the former actor turned mercenary, who's like really good at laying traps because he's an actor. He pretends to be, oh, I'm the wounded merchant here, and then they spring a trap. This actor turned mercenary I thought was a great idea for a character. And but they mention him in passing. He's minor background thing. We're not going to get every little river lord, and I understand that. But the only ones that really I had to say against my mental fanfic aren't going to show up in season 2 are the Greyjoys and the Martells. That I wanted scenes of Dalton Greyjoy getting ravens or emissaries from these factions, and that really isn't worth it. It doesn't make sense that you could leave Dalton out of season 2, and he really only enters the story after the battle by the lakeshore. That when the Lannister army gets really badly bloodied in a major battle, he starts raiding the coasts, and Joanna has to lead the home front fighting him off. So you could get by with just mention in dialogue, establish what of the Iron Islands. Well, Dalton Greyjoy's trying to see who's going to come out on top before he picks a side. Something like that. That you don't need a character in the flesh. Geographic, because we don't want people teleporting. It'll be hard for them to get face-to-face emissaries there. In contrast, slightly more than Dalton Greyjoy, I'm not angry about that. Okay, he's in season 3, is the Martells, who aren't really part of this story. That the Greyjoys come in, but they come in later, the Martells don't. Is in my mental, my headcanon fanfic, that you need to invent scenes to give the small council characters something to do, because they're not on the front. On both sides, that you need, for the Green Council in King's Landing, for Rhaenyra's council on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra doesn't do a lot chronologically in season 2. She's reacting to things happening in the war. Think of what Cersei and Tywin were doing in season 3. They're reacting to war movements at the small council. But you have to plan that out because it's not face-to-face. So I thought a great thing, and I still think they should do this, I'd be happy if they did, there's just not much chance of it with only 8 episodes, is, they actually mentioned the Prince of Dorne in season 1. I was surprised at that. They mentioned him in dialogue, and that's what gives me some hope for this. They were setting him up. That in episode 6 of season 1 at the Small Council, they said, oh, Dorne has sided with the Triarchy again under Corin Martell. And in the books, at the beginning of the war, both sides send alliance proposals to him, and he instead declares his neutrality, because Dorne has been devastated by dragons in the past. I mean, they were still independent, but they paid for it in blood. Like, they lost half their population. I love that whole idea of, well, the Greens are mostly from the Reach and the Stormlands. The parts of Westeros that border Dorne, that are their ancestral enemies. But on the other hand, more recently, Daemon has been killing the Dornish in the Stepstones, fighting his war. So it's this whole thing of, and Valyrians fighting in the Stepstones. So it's a question of, well, if I side with Daemon and the Valyrians, you're the guys that killed my father, but the Reach and the Stormlands, they're the guys that killed my grandfather, so I'm going to sit back and watch you guys kill each other. That's the position I'm in here. So, Corran declares his neutrality at the beginning of the war. And at some point in the middle of the war, Corran dies, apparently of natural causes, old age, because by the end of the war, he was succeeded by his daughter, Alejandra. Unlike Corran, who's this off-screen character, Alejandra Martell is a major character in the sequel era to the Dance of the Dragons. The immediate sequel era is the Regency era, the Aftermath era, where action shifts back to Dorne because they get embroiled in civil wars in the free cities that are playing out with fighting in the Stepstones. Dorne gets involved too. Alan Oakenfist gets sent with Iron Throne fleets to deal with it, so he meets Alejandra, so it's a whole thing. She's in a major subplot there. And again, Dorne, equal primogeniture, that she has a younger brother. She inherited ahead of him because, well, it's Dorne. So there's other Martells that she has a younger sister and a younger brother. You don't need to know them yet. But at the very least, Alejandra, I thought a great way to set her up would be to go Corran, who's still alive in Season 2, have him send Alejandra as like a delegate to King's Landing for one episode, as an envoy, and have her do that as a face-to-face conversation, have her come to... Because you're not going to invent Dorne as a set, as a location with all that new stuff. You have people come to the council room. Just go, hi, I'm Alejandra, I'm an envoy from Dorne, and we've decided we're going to be neutral rather than side with one or the other, and have them all be disappointed. I still think that could work. The more I talk myself into it, I think they could be... Maybe that was an idea they were entertaining. They might have had to drop it at some point of why were they setting up Corran Martell by name in Season 1. But I kind of hope that even if that came true, even if my hopes are all realized, it would at most be a cameo in a single scene. One scene where we'd have Alejandra as an envoy. That's probably not happening. Dalton is definitely not happening. That doesn't mean they're cutting Dalton. Why am I so hard on myself? They're going to introduce him in Season 3 when he... Even if they put him in Season 2, it would be as a cameo, is my point. So why get upset that, look, we're going to introduce him when we actually... It makes more sense to have him appear in the flesh and cast the actor closer to when they'd actually be a major role, because otherwise the actor would be hesitant to... You want to tie me down for a year when I only did one scene in one season, but I come back later? That would be weird. So in terms of who they're cutting, who they're not cutting, we're worried that they're merging some of the dragon scenes. We have no reason to think that. Just how are they going to handle that some characters will be inevitably be merged? I don't know, but in terms of are they cutting entire subplots, I don't think so. Because they're not cutting the Greyjoys, it's just that's really a Season 3 thing. The Martells, they could handle that much as Season 1 did, where they mention in dialogue, I got a letter back from the Martells spurning our alliance offer. They don't need Alejandra to come in the flesh to King's Landing. I would have liked it if she did. I don't have a problem. So much of this could be addressed with character exists, it's just in dialogue, because they come in Season 3. So, I know I'm rambling here, but people asking, are you worried about that they'll cut characters and things because 8 episodes instead of 10? Well, I think they're going to go for 5 seasons, and these are just the story. This is an ongoing question. What are the story breaks exactly? Some characters will be shorted a bit. I mean, obviously, like, if we had 13 episodes in Season 1 like they wanted, Laena Velaryon and Harwin Strong would have had more to do. But they weren't cut. They tried to work them in. Unlike Benioff and Weiss, these are competent writers who just... The razor efficiency of Season 1, that there was no fat on that season, as they say, that they were cutting it, the meat, it was all meat, there were no superfluous scenes, everything served a purpose. I'm not worried that I think that we will, much like Season 1 afterwards, well, there's a character here, what was one of my favorites, but on the whole, as an adaptation of the entire thing, this was still holding up. I mean, they might cut Sarah Snow, or Pate of Longleaf, or Trombo the mercenary actor, and I'll be, yeah, that's not a thing, but on the whole, if they serve these other major characters justice... I wonder what the point was in Game of Thrones, where I realized they're cutting major characters, that this is actually a problem. That They should. There was a point in season 4 where people are telling me they should have set up Jane Poole already. What the hell is going on here? Or Euron for season 2, where we realized they aren't really. They didn't know if they'd come back, and they didn't really plan it out. But at what point they were cutting the Tyrell's mother is still alive. Or the big one is the older Tyrell brothers. Loras is the third brother. That at a certain point you're like, they're not doing that storyline as an entire storyline, not just a character. I'm not really worried for this. And even then, there's like some people won't be in season 2 because they're meant to come in season 3, and you could build that argument of, well, we didn't want to outpace it. I get that. So I'm already 20 minutes into this, but I'm not worried about subplots. So because the huge one was Daeron. They said he was in it. I'm not worried anymore. I keep saying worry, I'm sorry. Just I'll keep track of this. Are they merging certain other characters? They need to. That is most of what we report on here. So please like and subscribe. And we're going to get a lot more info out of the Wales filming. That right now, I'm recording this June 10th. That first week of July, they're going to do a lot of filming in Wales, which is going to be stuff in the Riverlands and stuff at Dragonstone and in other places and in the Reach. And we'll get a lot more casting info then. That'll help us put more puzzle pieces together.